Today I'm building a shelf for a train collector. Before diving into the project, I went out to the Colorado's Mining Museum to see an old steam engine in action. This thing was pretty wild and got me excited to build some stuff. So I headed back to the shop and started out by milling up the lumber and cutting the pieces to length. The shelves are going to attach to the supports using a combination of a half-lap joint and a bridle joint. So I set up a jig the thickness of the shelf to route out the bridle joint using a pattern bit in the router. I built the jig so the sides are the same width as the space between the shelves so I could use it as a guide to place each shelf in the exact spot on both the vertical supports. This way I'm assured that everything will line up perfectly. I used the jig as a guide to square up the corners left by the round bit before moving on to the next position. Now that I had the dados routed out on one side, I still needed to transfer their location onto the other side, and of course I wanted them to be in the exact spot. Since I'm going to be cutting a half lap in between the bridle joints, I just used a pattern bit to get one started enough so I could use it as a registration spot. Then I dropped in a piece of wood to rest my jig against to cut the dados out on the other side. Then the same procedure as before to square up the corners. Once I defined the corner, I moved the jig out of the way so I could clean up the rest of the joint. Now to create the half lap portion of the joint. So I don't route too far, I cut some spacers and secured them in place. I headed over to the router table and finished routing out all the spaces for the half lap joints. Even though each shelf has a different offset from the vertical support, I still set up a stop block on my miter gauge to add some stability and to make the cut a little safer and easier to line up. Then I made a plywood story stick where I cut 2 notches in it the distance between the vertical supports. I used that to set up the stop block for each of the 3 shelves so the spacing on each shelf would be exactly the same. Otherwise the shelves would not go together. At this point it seemed to be a good idea to do a test fit to be sure everything was lining up good. While I had it together, I made a jig to route out some mortises for some floating tenons to strengthen the vertical supports across the areas where I routed out for the shelves. It just clips over the shelves and around the supports, and with a collar and a plunge bit I routed out the mortises. I just worked my way around to each joint. I then switched jigs to route out a slot in the center of each support to glue in a French cleat. I will save this jig so when I get out on the job site I can hold it up to the wall and mark the exact location of the mating cleat. And of course after routing I squared up the hole with a chisel. I pulled it apart and moved on to a decorative detail of cutting arches on the front support pieces. I made a plywood template on the bandsaw to be sure I liked the shape. Then the bandsaw left a little bit of a jagged edge, so I hand sanded it smooth with a flexible sanding strip. To reduce tear out and the workload on the router, I rough cut the supports with the bandsaw and then with a flush trim bit, I routed them flush to the template. The template was held in place with some double stick tape. The final decorative detail was cutting the hole for the tunnel. I made a plywood template the shape of the tunnel, hogged out most of the material at the drill press, and did a final cleanup pass at the router table. I broke my scroll saw a few years ago, but I have this little baby CNC, so I programmed it to cut a trim piece for the tunnel. When installing the trim piece, I dropped a piece of scrap wood in the slot where the shelf goes to help line up the trim piece to the bottom edge while I glued it in place. I intentionally cut it oversized so I wouldn't have to worry about lining it up exactly with the tunnel. Once the glue was dry, I just flush trimmed it off at the router table. Now we're getting ready for the final glue up. Since there are so many parts, I used some epoxy to glue it all together to give me plenty of working time. Once I got the main shelves together, I cut some stock to make the floating tenons and French cleats to hang it from the wall. I then rounded over the edges at the router table for the floating tenons. I had glued and screwed the French cleat into the slot I had made earlier and set aside its mate to be screwed to the wall on the job site. Then I glued my floating tenons into place. I finished the whole thing up with some poly, hung it on the client's wall, and he had a really cool shelf that not only displayed his train, but interacted with it, becoming part of its story. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, share, follow me on Instagram, join me on Patreon, hit the bell, watch another video. You know what to do. Just do something.